Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you to this conversation today with author Erich Schwartzel, who joins us from Los Angeles and who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal and covers Hollywood and China's connection to the industry. We're here today to talk to him about his book, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. Really pleased to have Erich. It's a very important dynamic of the great powers competition arena that CSPC has been covering for the last couple of years. We have focused on several aspects of great powers competition, focused primarily on competition with China over advanced technologies and the relationship between that and our national security. But what we discovered when we broke that down is there is, of course, a hard power element to that competition: investment in military capabilities and technology, investment in rapidly advancing technologies that we feel will shape the future of collection and use of data, of advanced computing, and looking deeply into supply chains and how we orient ourselves to the challenge. We discovered, of course, that there are some particular challenges competing with a country like China that has unified government and industrial structure, a very much top-down and focused and coordinated connection between those areas. We came to the determination that it wouldn't be appropriate for us to try to out-China China in the sense that we would try to replicate that top-down system. The United States system has some other amazing advantages, but we do need to do a better job of coordinating some of our efforts. We've seen advancements in investment and I think even our work to coordinate the private and public sector actors on some of these questions has moved the needle somewhat. But we are in a competition that is moving very rapidly. And there is an important soft power aspect to the competition. We are in a narrative competition as well as a power competition and a technological competition for projecting the advantages of market-based and democratic systems against authoritarian systems that are centrally controlled. Part of that narrative battle can be waged in terms of what our official government bodies say publicly. We can organize conferences of democracies to meet together and emphasize the advantages of our systems and coordinate our messaging. But at the end of the day, there is a very large and powerful soft power component that simply comes from controlling cultural messages. And I think what we've come to understand is that the Chinese Communist Party, the government, is very organized with a plan to influence those cultural aspects that kind of prepare the field for how all the other arguments and narrative messages land. And so it's very important for us, even if we'll never achieve the level of coordination of some of our competitors, to understand how they operate and consider what we ought to do to play to our advantages. That's why I think Erich's work is so important in helping us focus on how the Chinese government approaches Hollywood and that aspect of this cultural competition. We have, for the last several years, focused on several anecdotes in the space. One of the most, I think, telling was the issue around NBA actors and how they discussed Chinese issues and what happened when they said things that weren't perceived as positive by the Chinese government. And we learned a lot about the commercial connections and power levers that the Chinese government can wield just based on their market power. But there's a lot more to it than that. There is a coordinated plan to influence just how the culture is reflected. So let me just say that, Erich, we appreciate you being here, that this is a meaty topic, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk through your book with us. You're the expert, so let me get out of the way and let you talk. But if you would please, spend a little time, tell us about the book process, how you got there, and some of the key findings that you think our audience should take away. And take as much time as you like. And then when you're finished with that opening statements, I think Dan's going to come in and move us forward from there. So again, Erich, thank you so much for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you to the center for having me this morning. I mean, that introduction actually set up beautifully what I was trying to do here, which was use the story of China and Hollywood as something of a Trojan horse to explain this great powers dynamic. And what I thought was the underappreciated cultural component of it. I came to the topic when I joined the journal in 2013. I had been covering actually natural gas drilling and fracking in Pennsylvania for a local paper there when I was hired to join the LA bureau of the journal. And I joined at a very specific moment in the China-Hollywood relationship, which was a bit of a boom time. There was a lot of money, Chinese money, flowing into Hollywood, and you would see trade notices where Chinese actresses were cast in Hollywood movies, or some Chinese billionaire that no one had ever heard of had shown up with a suitcase full of cash and was financing all of these movies. And there was this sense in Hollywood that it was China's turn to be dumb money, to be the country or the wealthy individual who comes to Los Angeles to attend some glitzy premieres and then, leave with his tail between his legs. But there was something very different about China's coming to Hollywood that previous countries really didn't have. One was that it had a huge home market. It had a box office that was growing by double-digit percentage points every year. And the other thing it had, which you alluded to in your introduction, was a regime that had very high priorities when it came to controlling messaging, not just within its own borders, but outside as well. So there was a political component to this relationship from the start. And as the US-China contrast became more and more apparent on the world stage, it seemed obvious that the movies had become this unexpected proxy battleground for those ideas. And this really amplified after Trump's election, and that contrast between the West and China grew more and more pronounced. So I started on the book in about 2017, 2018, and went back in time to figure out how we got here. And what I learned was, Hollywood movies, it should come as no surprise, had largely been shut off from Chinese audiences after Mao's revolution. And so while the American movie swept the globe as this most famous form of soft power, China was largely shut off from that influence until 1994, when American movies started to be imported into Chinese theaters. And this obviously coincided with sort of a broader opening up in China into the global economy. Obviously, we're a few years after Deng Xiaoping's reforms are starting to introduce more capitalist elements to the Chinese model. But frankly, the reason why Hollywood movies were shipped to China in '94 was because Chinese theaters needed their revenue desperately. Because after decades and decades of propaganda and state-sponsored documentaries, audiences were bored, and they were frankly finding better entertainment in piracy shops. So they started bringing in Hollywood movies. The first Hollywood movie that was allowed into China was The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford. It made $3 million, which is nothing, but at the time was a blockbuster in China. So obviously, if you're running a studio back in the 90s, there's no real reason to pay much attention to China because the revenue is so small. But that would change as China urbanized. And as we saw this massive migration from rural communities into new Chinese cities, the Chinese box office started to grow accordingly. And at one point, China was building 27 new movie screens a day. And This was around 2008, 2009. Grosses started climbing, and something very important happens in the US, which is that domestic movie going starts to flatline. And so suddenly you have a dynamic where Hollywood, which had thought it had pretty much saturated the world, has not only a new market, but a new growth market at a time when other revenues are flatlining. So you can imagine the incredible political leverage this quickly translates into, because it's not, releasing a movie in China is not like releasing a movie in France. You have to send it over to the Ministry of Propaganda for approval. And so in order to access that growth market, you have to make sure that there's nothing in the movie that will offend the Communist Party. Not only that, but you also have to make sure that you don't make any other movies that will offend the Communist Party. So there were all these examples where Hollywood quickly absorbed the lessons, right? So for instance, in the mid 90s, Disney made a movie called Kundun, directed by Martin Scorsese, that was about a young Dalai Lama. This was not a movie that was made for the Chinese market. No one making that movie thought they would release it in China. Nonetheless, when the party learned that the movie existed at all, they banned Disney, the entire company, from China for a year. So it only takes a few examples like that for Hollywood studios to learn, oh, this isn't just about the movies we're trying to get into China. It's about the movies we make anywhere in the world. And so as China's economic leverage grew, it became a situation where suddenly that economic leverage translated into incredible political power, because China was able to control what stories were told on screens anywhere in the world. And so this is when you started to have some high profile examples. I mean, you mentioned the NBA, which was kind of the exclamation point in the sports world's integration with China. I think there have been so many throughout Hollywood's relationship with it. Whether it's James Bond movie Skyfall, cutting a scene in which James Bond shoots and kills a Chinese security guard because the censors worried that made China look weak, or the censors demanding that a movie, the Men in Black movies, remove a scene in which the memories of everyday civilians are wiped from their brains, because that was a metaphor that hewed too closely to authoritarianism. So there are all these ways, large and small, that the American movie started to change. And I think a culture of self-censorship started to take root at the studio level, where studios started to anticipate Beijing's concerns and in many ways do their job for them. Now, I think just given the center's focus here, I wanted to talk a little bit about China's efforts now to replicate that soft power that America had. So I think if we can agree that the 20th century was the American century, and in large part due to that soft power, I think China's designs on the 21st century have a similar soft power component. Because while all this is going on, as China's box office is rising and Hollywood is doing more and more to acquiesce, to access that market, China has something of a student-teacher dynamic at play with Hollywood, where it is studying and in many cases hiring Hollywood experts to learn how to do it themselves. And something very interesting starts to happen. American movies grow more and more commercial, and they grow more and more popular. It used to be that, to the frustration of Chinese authorities, audiences there largely preferred American movies to Chinese movies because they were considered so much better. Well, Chinese movies, started to get more and more commercial and more entertaining. And suddenly Chinese audiences started to go to their home domestic movies more frequently. Now, I think what's happening there is the Chinese authorities know that this is a very critical medium. And so when you had relations between the US and China, for instance, really deteriorate around 2020, suddenly a lot of movies about the Korean War started being shown in Chinese theaters. Now, why the Korean War? Well, America doesn't look so good in that one. And the movie in China became actually like a direct mirroring of Beijing's priorities. Now, whenever I started writing this book, I think I was met with a lot of skepticism in Hollywood. And frankly, I think skepticism born out of complacency, because I would hear people say to me, you know, China is never going to succeed at its soft power efforts because American audiences will never go see a Chinese movie. And it's true that American audiences are largely allergic to going to see foreign films on the big screen. Well, I would think to myself, you know, there's a big world out there. And I'm sure the center has been looking into the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, what I was struck to learn is that the Belt and Road Initiative has really also built for China a potential distribution arm for its movies and TV shows. So before I toss it over to Dan, I'll end with the last reporting trip I made before COVID, you know, kept me at home, was to Kenya, which is the recipient of many Belt and Road projects. It's, you know, there are roads being paved by Beijing, there are train stations being built by Beijing, there are hospital supplies being provided by Beijing. And there's also a program that is covered a little bit less, which is called the 10,000 Villages Project, which is operated out of Beijing and is distributing low-cost satellite dishes to 10,000 African villages. And these satellite dishes not only cost less than the Kenyan alternatives, but they also come with channels that have Chinese movies, Chinese TV shows on them, and serve as these kind of cultural introductions to the country that has an ubiquity everywhere else around them. So, I mean, it was one of the most extraordinary moments of the book writing process. I walked into an apartment 2 hours outside Nairobi to a family watching a Chinese soap opera, and met a young boy who would play as the Monkey King whenever he would play with his friends. And one night I went back to the house and we watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And there wasn't necessarily a wholesale replacement of American culture taking place, but there was more of a coexistence than I think most Americans would expect. And finally, to your point about how this plays into the great powers dynamic, well, there are politicians in Kenya who view themselves as more aligned with Chinese values than Western values. As I interviewed the film minister who's in charge of importing all movies and TV shows. He's a very socially conservative man. And he said to me, I love importing Chinese movies. They've already been censored for me. And the day that I was there happened to be the day of President Trump's first impeachment. It was January of 2020. And CNN was on TV in his office. And here I am, I'm sort of this, I guess, in the moment, this one-man representative of America. And he looks at CNN and he looks at me and he says, look at how you treat your leaders. He says, you know, if you were in my shoes, what system would look better to you? And it really crystallized for me the stakes here, that it is not just the movies and TV shows that people are watching to pass the time or to relax after work, but movies and TV shows that are also subtly or not so subtly promoting a mode of governance. And if we agree that the next several decades are going to be defined by which mode wins, then I think the movies and TV shows that are being shipped around the world are going to play a critical role in that. And where we sit right now, China is making aggressive moves in that space, and Hollywood remains beholden to China. So there's not really it's really not a fair fight in this moment. That is I think probably the thing that I was most drawn to in reporting this book, and I think what has the most potential consequence. But I'm happy to dive in anywhere you and Dan and all viewers want to go. But again, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I'll take over from here. This is absolutely fascinating and fits in well with our as we've said, our geotech conversations and great power competition. First, I would say from our geotech perspective, where we look now, where at the corporate interests, and for many, they're not just entertainment companies. Entertainment is a division, part of a broader enterprise, or entertainment projects exist in a portfolio of investments. And you reference one of my favorite phrases studying Chinese, Shajing Jingho, which is, kill the chicken to scare the monkey. How do we need to look at how firms are pressured via their entertainment divisions? And, in instances, what their other divisions they're operating, be it infrastructure, technology here in the US, what do you think policymakers need to be aware of in that dynamic?
Yeah, and I think you raised a critical point. I referenced the kind of the case study of Kundun, the Dalai Lama film that Disney made. It's a very telling example because this was a movie being greenlit and produced by a subdivision of a subdivision of a subdivision of a much larger company. And yet its production threatened the entire enterprise, and became something of a contaminant that spread to Disney's theme park aspirations in the market, Disney's toy aspirations in the market. I think that it's an important element here because since then, it's not like the American entertainment system has grown more independent. In fact, one of the main reasons why Hollywood studios grew so dependent on China was because the studios were swallowed by increasingly bigger and bigger parent companies. And the conglomeratization of Hollywood really put a lot of pressure on the studios to make bigger and bigger returns. And so it's one of the reasons why there are so many movies today that are these mega blockbusters, these big superhero films. It's because when you are running Universal Pictures, right, you are little more than a line item in the broader Comcast empire. So you have to make sure you're trying to post as big a number as possible. And those big numbers often require China, right? So it's one of the dynamics here at home that I think gave China more leverage over the last decade. And I think that, there's this we're in this moment right now where China is shutting off a lot of access, especially when it comes to the movies, and trying to really control how many Western imports it allows in every year. And I think that there's this mistaken notion that might give these studios some kind of creative freedom. I mean, I think there's this sense where, if you can't rely on China, you're not going to get into China, maybe it's time to, dust off the Tiananmen Square script, because who cares, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's naive, because I think every major studio, there's now 5 of them, are part of parent companies that have significant interests elsewhere, if not in the box office. So I think it's worth looking at, and also I think it's a dynamic that's replicated in so many other industries too, where as these companies get bigger and bigger, there's going to be some interest that has to be preserved somewhere.
That's actually your point there segues well. I think the comparison to other industries, and you talk too about what creativity you see. With many of these productions, or the way we go about it, technology is another one they talk about. Innovation requires a certain messiness to it. I would say the same probably could equally apply to entertainment, the arts. How does China plan to compete in a creative field while still having top-down censorship or approved ideas? How long can that go? Because I think some of the messiness you see in American movies is some of their appeal, or the fact that Hollywood draws from so many creative cultures and the messiness there. How does China get creative if it wants to compete?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I think many consider it a critical liability here. There's an example in my book of the release of Kung Fu Panda. When DreamWorks Animation made Kung Fu Panda, it really threw Chinese leaders into something of an existential crisis, because they asked themselves, wait, why did an American company take our national mascot and our heritage and make this essentially soft power tool? You know, they made the Chinese mascot a cuddly, you know, children's favorite. And they actually studied the film, and they would call the executives who produced it over, and they would try to kind of reverse engineer it. And they would ask, you know, for those kind to sort of break down that storytelling alchemy, right? I mean, there's a lot of absurdism in those kinds of those children's movies. And a lot of the Chinese leaders would ask, you know, well, why did you make the panda's dad a duck? Why would you do that? Is it some kind of commentary? Are you trying to make a point? And they'd say, no, it's just weird and funny, and you just have to, you do that for kids' movies. And in fact, at that time, the Chinese leaders passed legislation where they tried to encourage their animators to be more individualistic. And it's interesting because now, about a decade later, we have seen China's animation industry really, you know, grow quite more sophisticated and much more successful. But it is, I mean, the other point that often comes up is Chinese schooling, right? You know, what, you know, if you have schooling that emphasizes sort of falling in line or thinking one way, and trying to sort of sand off the edges of individual expression, what might that do to creativity going forward? And then there's also the question that's, I think, really been a question since the Soviet era of, you know, can effective art be created within the strictures of a censorious regime? You know, it's interesting. I think more recently, I have to imagine that Beijing is looking with quite a bit of frustration toward Korea, and Korea's success in exporting movies like Parasite or shows like Squid Game, and the critical point being that Chinese authorities would never allow the production of a Squid Game or a Parasite. You know, not only is it far too violent, but also just the class commentary is a non-starter, right? So yeah, I think it is a critical question, and I think it's something that I think shades and really, I mean, I said it wasn't a fair fight. I think in America's corner is that kind of creative freedom that you described.
Right. Yeah, it's that challenge. In a free capitalist system, you can make money by criticizing the system. You can't.
I mean,
can't
honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
Not only that. I mean, how many movies do we go see where, like, the third act reveal is that the CIA was the bad guy all along, right?
Right. Exactly. Finally, you know, because we look at the overlap with technology, and I think technology and entertainment are one and one now in many ways. And I imagine lots of heartburn, restless nights in Los Angeles there about what the future delivery of entertainment is going to be. The post-pandemic, the big screen, more and more we see on our televisions, the prestige productions. You talked about the Kenyans getting theirs via satellite television, but we also see now everything's going to be on 6 inches in your phone. You know, it's going to be those screens. What are the Chinese doing? You know, TikTok was a big thing in the previous administration towards the end that lost momentum. But what are the new entertainment technologies that China's leading in, just as we led in cinema in the 20th century?
Well, look, I think if I were joining the Wall Street Journal today, I think 5 years from now we'd be talking about a TikTok book. I think that has to be the next area of focus. I think that it has to be really China's most powerful export in recent history, right? And it's interesting because I know there was a moment where it seemed like there was a lot more scrutiny being placed on it that's kind of passed to my eye, and which is fascinating. And I think that you know, when it comes to streaming, there's an interesting dynamic here, which is that China has an incredibly robust streaming market. In fact, it has 3 services operated by Chinese firms that are kind of equally popular. And to protect those firms, China's really kept out any competition. So Netflix is not in mainland China, Disney Plus is not in mainland China. And I think in Netflix's case, it seems to have given the company a little bit of a longer leash. You'll see on Netflix shows that engage with China a little bit more critically. There are documentaries on Netflix that I think other studios would probably be more reluctant to carry. But I think it's only because it's been made absolutely clear that they cannot access that market. And I really can't, to my mind, think of any other firm of Netflix's size and profile where that's the case, where there's really just no way they're in, or that they will ever get in.
Well, that's fascinating. I appreciate this. It's it's your work. Some policymakers, the guys at South Park. It's an interesting group of people who have been raising attention to this. But I'm glad you were able to join us for this discussion. Really appreciate your book, and I'm going to turn it over to Joshua for the rest of the Q&A. Thank you.
Terrific. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. And again, on behalf of CSPC, Glenn and Dan, and thank you, Eric, for this absolutely fantastic book. It was an unexpected find at Kramer Books here in DC, and I basically read it in about one sitting. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you.
I'm actually going to start off with a question from the audience. So Kevin Barron is with Defense One here. And he writes, I've been tracking how public opinion follows or doesn't the battle among political and security leaders to convince Americans that China is a threat. For some, you can't be a patriot and do business with China. Is the Hollywood sector guilty of anti-Americanism, or are they right to reject the with us or against us framing that is increasingly reaching political leaders and audiences?
Fascinating question. And I think something that is going to really define the next 2 years or so, especially if we have a Republican-led Congress. I think this could become more and more of an issue. And I think one of the reasons why the Hollywood story here hits a little emotionally is because America over the past century has often conscripted Hollywood to do its bidding. I mean, even this surprised me, frankly, like even back in the 20s. I mean, so we're talking like the almost talkie era. Hollywood was called an adjunct of the State Department. And movies were often screened by politicians for approval before they were sent abroad. After World War II, movies were a critical part of the Marshall Plan, sent to Europe to try and congeal the continent and sell it on the virtues of capitalism and democracy. And then, of course, through the 80s, when every bad guy was a Soviet, there was this kind of Cold War mentality too. But I think, and I suspect that it's the same in the tech industry, over the past 15 years or so, according to the executives I talked to, as the overseas revenues have become more and more important, the studios think of themselves less and less as American companies, certainly based in America, largely operated by Americans, but making most of their money from overseas audiences. And I think that for many of these executives, if they were on this call and speaking bluntly, they would say, it's not my job to worry about what the US government wants, right? My job is to make money. Maybe even more cynically, I have a fiduciary obligation to shareholders to make money anywhere I can. I'm not, as one person in my book is quoted saying, I'm not the standard bearer of Western democracy. And this is a real change from the history of Hollywood. I don't want to give the impression that Hollywood's always been in lockstep with its government. There are certainly some real blemishes on its record, particularly in how it reacted to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. But it really, I think, for the first time, the China question is putting Hollywood executives at odds with their home government. And so I think really, I don't know what could change. I mean, I think certainly, as I said, Congress could make a lot of noise about this. I don't quite know what kind of legislation could be introduced to really police this. that would be palatable to either party. And I also, frankly, I mean, the gentleman asking the question would know this better than anyone, but I've also noticed that while there is this kind of consumer backlash, anytime there's a high profile censoring of a movie or some actor has to apologize for offending Beijing, there's this consumer response. It's like, basically says like, this is BS. Why is America being bossed around by China? But it fades very quickly. I have really been struck by just how quickly people seem to move on. So I'm a little stumped as to what kind of political or consumer backlash could result in any kind of change here.
It's interesting that you mentioned about that backlash aspect, because you write about Red Dawn, the remake of the classic '80s movie, and how they had rewritten the Chinese villain out and put the North Korean villain in, and then there was the uproar about that, and then nobody went to go see the movie because it was terrible.
Right. It was terrible. I mean, and what's interesting about that example is, so you're right that they'd filmed and completed this new version of Red Dawn with China as the invader, and then they had to hastily, in post-production, make it North Korea, which was resulted in an absurd movie. What was interesting is that what happened in 2012, and it was covered at the time, but there wasn't actually a big backlash against it. I think it was seen as kind of weird Hollywood doing some funny thing. It wasn't actually until 2018 or 2019 that Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo and Trump administration officials cited it as an acquiescence to China. And it was very telling, because it taught me that a lot of what I cover in the book was not hidden. It just was, there were decisions being made without the context of China being an ideological enemy or a rival. So it wasn't seen as a political act to censor your movies like it is today.
It's absolutely fascinating. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, something that I found very interesting in the book, was the way that the Hollywood studios themselves have sort of adapted to try to get into the Chinese market, where it's, they'll have a Huawei phone, or they'll have a suspiciously attractive actor or actress playing an almost superfluous role in it. I saw the movie Moonfall, which was not a very good movie at all, but there was an actress in it, and they kept focusing on her as she's a Chinese actress, and her entire character was entirely superfluous, but that wasn't meant for the American audience, clearly. And so I'm curious if you can talk about how Hollywood sort of has ham-fisted in some ways to try to do it, but has adapted and gotten smarter to try to cater to that market.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so what you're referring to are what they call Chinese elements, and because there was this, I call it reverse censorship in the book. There was this sense that as the market was growing, that you should try to exploit it for all it's worth, and so that means casting actors who might draw on audiences, setting scenes there, putting in Chinese product placement, and you started to see it everywhere. I think that it got so ham-handed. I mean, there's an example I spend a lot of time on. It was a Transformers movie that had all this product placement. None of it made any sense. So like they have a Chinese ATM at one point in the middle of Texas. You're right. The characters are often incredibly superfluous. And I think it was actually quite insulting, because it really underestimated the Chinese audiences, and who very quickly saw through the pandering, and they would refer to it as getting soy sauced. And they would say that these actresses who have these superfluous roles were flower vases, because they didn't do much of anything. And so I think there was eventually, I think some learned their lesson, and they realized, the best thing we can ship China is something that they cannot get anywhere else. So, America is still the only market where you can get a $300 million Avengers movie with the best special effects and the best action sequences. That is still going to do very well because it's unique. It's a unique product. But these attempts to kind of out China often fail. And Moonfalls actually fascinating example. I have to admit, I didn't catch that one, but I was not surprised to learn that it had these superfluous Chinese elements because a significant amount of that movie's budget came from a Chinese financier.
Oh, she's very heroic in the movie, but it's an unnecessarily heroic scene, and you're just sort of like, okay, I guess I don't know why that's there.
Right, exactly. Well, you know why it's there. It's
Yes.
there. It's there so that they can hopefully get into China. And I think the irony on that film is that I think it came out during the start of the COVID lockdowns. So I doubt it's even made much money there at all. I mean, it's interesting because that director, Roland Emmerich, his last movie also received money from China, and it was a movie about the Battle of Midway. Now, that makes sense on one level, right? Because it's a movie about, it's basically an anti-Japanese story. So you can understand why there might be some Chinese financing, but if you watch the film, there are scenes where American soldiers crash land in China, and are celebrated as heroes after they announce that they've just killed a bunch of Japanese. I mean, it's really, and I have to say, I was surprised that wasn't a bigger deal, just because that is not a movie about some sort of intergalactic disaster. It's a movie about an American war heroism that had its narrative quite doctored by Chinese influence.
I'm glad that you brought up the Marvel films, because I think it was in the last week or so, there's been two or three news pieces coming out about how Marvel is talking about refusing to change movies to accommodate the Chinese market, and that they're going to be okay if they don't get access to the Chinese market. Is that a one-off? Is that in response to market signals here in the United States? And what's your take on that dynamic?
Yeah, I've heard this. I've heard from studios that, when a movie is being approved for production, like they call it the green light meeting, executives will go around the table and they'll say, we're going to make this movie, and based on prior projections, we expect X amount in the US and Canada, Y amount overseas, and Z amount in China. China gets its own column. Well, I'm told that last column now is often zero, because you don't want to count on money. You don't want to send your bosses a projection that you can't count on, which is probably pretty smart from a business strategy perspective, right? Because then if you do have the money, you look like a genius, right? You projected for zero, you have 100. Wow, that's great. I think that there's some truth to that, just because the market has gotten so inaccessible to movies that at one point would have been no-brainers to get in. And so I would say that that is happening. I don't think it's necessarily ridding the studios of worrying about China altogether. I think they're just kind of trying to reach a new economic reality where, if they had projected to make 1.1 billion at the global box office, they're okay if it's only 900, because they didn't get into China.
That's fascinating. I'm curious if we can also talk about one thing that I was very much enjoyed in the book, because it's something that I don't think anyone's really going to have much exposure to, is the development of sort of the indigenous Chinese modern cinema scene. You're right about some of the directors that you've encountered over there, and how they're trying to generate their own basis, using, as you talked about earlier, the lessons from Hollywood of what works and importing them domestically.
Well, so I think you're right. I mean, so what's happened has been fascinating, because China's sort of post-Mao cinema, it sort of existed in two worlds. There was the sanctioned cinema, which you can imagine was just incredibly medicinal, and then there was also this kind of behind the scenes cinema known as the fifth generation. So these are movies like Farewell My Concubine, Raise the Red Lantern, films that were exalted on the world stage and critically acclaimed, but never approved for release in China. They kind of broke the rules. Now, as Hollywood films started to flow more and more into the market, Chinese movies became more and more commercial. So you started to see more Chinese comedies, Chinese dramas, Chinese science fiction films. And in the book, I call it their Amblin era, right? These movies that sort of Steven Spielberg-esque, the story of an ordinary man who suddenly finds himself in extraordinary circumstances. What's been interesting, though, is that we really haven't seen much of a alternative to that. So that fifth generation of the 80s and 90s who would make movies about the Cultural Revolution and would risk, banishment in telling certain stories, that avenue of filmmaking is really, really not that prevalent in China right now. In fact, a lot of those directors who got their start as these these bad boys of Chinese cinema have been steadily absorbed by the state and now make many movies about that are sanctioned by the government, and this kind of currency system has formed where I think Chinese authorities want popular movies, right? Because it's really good for their economy, right? It's like any real estate. These theaters are the anchor tenants in so many developments. Like it's in China's interest for the theaters to do well. So these commercial films are very good for them. But they also want to make sure that they can still use it for propagandistic aims. So it's not uncommon for directors to kind of land on a one for you, one for me model, where they can go and make their science fiction movie that makes a lot of money, but then they have to answer the phone when Beijing calls and says, we'd really love you to make a movie for the 100th anniversary of the army. And I would hear stories of directors being summoned from sets because they said, oh, it's time for another anniversary film. We need you, or the Olympics are coming up. We want a movie about our volleyball team. So go make that. It's, there's this other, Dan referenced the Chinese dialectic about the chicken. This other one that I think is really instructive translates as, use the West for its tools, but keep China as the essence. This idea that if you can import philosophy or a way of doing something, that you can kind of Chinify it as well. And I think that's what's happening with the films here, which is China has built a commercial film industry that looks a lot like America's, but they've married it with the propagandistic purposes established by Mao.
One of the things that I found fascinating, it's actually a question from one of our fellows, Robert Gerber, talking about the intellectual property theft aspect of things. And the knowledge transfer that was woven throughout all this aspect, where you had the directors and the film producers coming from Hollywood to China to help the industry there. But also at some point, you talked about the IMAX screens and the construction of the systems there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was, first of all, I mean, I think there's been one of the reasons why, the initial reasons why Hollywood wanted its movies in China was not because they thought they'd make money there, but it was because they were trying to wean Chinese consumers off of pirated VHS tapes and DVDs. They thought if we can get them into the theater, we at least get them to stop stealing all of our films. And the lack of intellectual property law in China is still a major issue for studios and content creators here in Hollywood. It's interesting. I was very interested when I started writing the book about this question of technology transfer, because it's very easy to understand when it's Boeing, right? It's like blueprints, but how do you transfer storytelling? And it's happened in several different ways. I mean, in some cases, Chinese companies have hired Hollywood directors and writers to go over and polish scripts or to oversee productions. They've also hired a crew. So it's not uncommon to hire, folks who specialize in rigging or stunts or lighting to literally show how to build a set or how to choreograph a stunt routine, something like that. But there's this one story that always struck me, which is a friend of mine who was hired to write scripts, went over and he was working on a drama. It was a Chinese movie about a man whose wife is away on a business trip and has to take care of his kid by himself. And there's a moment where, and the writer said, you know, if you're going to tell this story, you need like a moment of temptation. You need the guy to sort of be tempted by someone. So they come up with this scene where this guy who's on his own meets a very pretty young maid. And the actor on set was really upset. And he said to the writer, he's like, this is ridiculous. A man of my stature would never be interested in a maid. And the writer explained to him, do you know who that maid is? He said, the maid is every woman in the audience watching this movie who can put herself in that character's shoes as this kind of surrogate and think that there's this fantasy where maybe that a man like that would be interested in her as well. So that is, I mean, that is some real knowledge transfer, right? That's really sort of describing the ineffable power of storytelling and trying to bring it to Chinese stories. But yeah, I think it's still something that is being worked out. But the student-teacher dynamic has always been prevalent in this relationship. But I will say, easier said than done because of those intellectual property issues.
I'm curious what you think the future of this is, because you write about, so I can't remember the name of it, and please forgive me, is the sort of the Game of Thrones style massive cinema universe that they're creating. What is the future of this? Where do you see, absent the politics, for example, and we'll come to that in a second, but where do you see the direction of Chinese cinema going? Because we talked about Wolf Warrior 2 a little bit, but there wasn't a third one, which was kind of interesting. But what's the direction that you see for sort of Chinese cinema, both big and small screen?
I think it's going to continue like this. I mean, you referenced this movie that's coming out this year, which is, they're calling it China's Lord of the Rings. It's this massive trilogy based on this Chinese folklore that they're trying to really franchise. This is an economic element that China has yet to master, which is the franchise, meaning the movie that can spawn sequels and toy sales and theme park rides, that kind of thing. That still eludes them. But I think that it's going to sort of continue in the dynamic I described, which is Chinese movies will continue to be major successes in China. It will be very hard for them to travel abroad. But the cultural complement to things like the Belt and Road investments will still be, frankly, more powerful than America can counter. So I'll just give you like a little micro example of this, which is in Africa, in Kenya, a lot of the people in the rural villages watching these movies and TV shows, they speak local dialects that are too obscure for American firms to pay to dub into those local dialects. So they subtitle a lot of their movies and TV shows. Well, China is eating the cost to dub their movies and TV shows because the calculation is a Kenyan family is more likely to watch a dubbed Chinese film than a subtitled American film. And it feels like there's an acknowledgement there. They might have to pay to close that gap in appeal. So that tells you there's differing motivations there, right? There's a purely economic motivation out of America, and there's an economic and political motivation out of Beijing.
No, it's really fascinating. I want to flip back to Dan for sort of the last word before going to Glenn on this one. But as I said, this was an absolutely fascinating conversation and a fantastic book that I learned a lot about both the strategic competition aspect, but also just the nature of Hollywood and I highly recommend it to everybody on the call, how everything weaves together in a way that we typically don't see or anticipate on these multiple levels of, like, we see strategic competition between militaries and economies, but the way that the cultural element pulls so much together is one of the reasons I enjoyed this, probably one of the best books of the year for me already. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Over to you, Dan.
No, a great read. And yes, one I'm actually going to be recommending in our summer reading list as well. So it will be That'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. So for folks in the audience, we will have our reading list coming out. But Erich, yes, no, great for you to join us. You great points you raise as someone who's been a fan of cinema. I appreciate your point too on the entire franchise as someone who, from their first Star Wars toy as a kid through now as an adult, it's that power of creativity, that power of the arts, and a business of money and national power at stake as well. Great points you've raised, something we all need to consider, and look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Let me just add my thanks, Erich. This has been a very interesting conversation, so many parallels to other areas of this great powers competition that we have thought about, from the hard to the soft power aspects and everything in between. And I was really kind of struck by your description in answering some of the questions about expectations of our own industry. Your book has really helped us understand the expectations the Chinese government has of its own industry and its planning, and how it carries that out. We don't have that kind of top-down system here. So ours is much more organic, and yet there is still historical elements of influence in both directions between industry and the government, particular messages that are convenient to the way the US sees the world and itself, that have been reflected in the art of cinema, and times when it didn't happen. And I find this kind of notion of expectation to be one that's really thought-provoking. What should we expect Hollywood executives' responsibility to be to the message war, right? It's not really their job to worry about more than the bottom line. On the other hand, as Americans, we would expect that thought to enter the equation somewhere. What's fair? Do we expect that Hollywood executives take on a role in the narrative battle? It's also a kind of an interesting question, like how much do we expect the kind of life to be influenced by the art versus the art reflecting life? In other words, if there is a natural current of skepticism towards aspects of the Chinese government that exists in American society, would you expect to see that reflected in the art that's produced in Hollywood? And how much do they seek to manage that for commercial gain? And so there are a lot of different aspects of this that I think are fascinating for our own understanding of what our responsibility is in influencing how our industries connect with this competition, this competitive aspect. And so you've given us a lot to think about. And of course, we're always looking for a kind of particular American answer. And we are always, I think, buoyed by the tremendous innovation and the advantages that the American economy and our approach to creativity produce. But we are in a competition, and we have to think about this. And I appreciate, Erich, you surfacing a lot of these concepts to really enrich our ability to dive in and think carefully about these things in a much more informed way. So thank you for taking the time to put the book together based on your journalism, and also thank you for spending this time with us and engaging in this intellectual exercise today. I want to thank our participants today and those who will watch the video recording. Very fascinating conversation, and all the best. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to keeping you in the conversation and seeing you again soon. Have a great weekend. Take care.